In the cold silence of a sterile command center, where life and death hang on the flicker of a screen, a dozen men are lost. But beyond the rigid rules and the ticking clock, a ghost of a pilot, Falcon 7, is about to defy every order. They say she isn't supposed to exist, a relic of a different time, flying a rusty old plane. But as the low growl of her A-10 Warthog rolls in from the sky, a different kind of truth emerges, one where compassion and defiance are the only rules that matter. This is the story of a hero who was willing to lose everything to save lives that had already been forgotten. The operations center at Fort Reagan pulsed with a suffocating tension that clung to the skin like humidity before a storm. It was the kind of room where lives were weighed in real time, where each blink of a cursor could spell life or death for soldiers far beyond the walls. At this pre-dawn hour, the air carried a metallic tang of overheated circuitry and stale coffee, the scent of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, throwing their sickly white glow across a maze of consoles and monitors. Colonel Marcus Ellison stood at the eye of the storm, his boots planted firmly on the polished floor, hands braced against the edge of the central command table. His eyes, sharp, hard, honed by decades of fieldwork, were locked on the tactical map projected in front of him. A single pulsing red icon glared like a wound on the screen. Echo Unit 3, 12 soldiers, pinned down in the jagged ravines of Red Zone ZK4. The reports had come in as fractured, static-laced cries for help, stitched together from the edge of chaos. A firefight in a narrow gorge. Enemy forces with the high ground, entrenched and waiting. The last transmission had not been words so much as desperation. Half a plea, half a scream, cut short by the earth-shaking roar of an explosion. Ellison didn't need video feeds to see it. He knew that helpless feeling, the hollow pit in a soldier's chest when there's no cover and no way out. He had been there in another war, a lifetime ago. That cold shard of memory dug into his gut as he listened to his comms officer struggle to speak. "Sir," the young man stammered, fingers twitching over his console. "We're still getting signals, but they're breaking up. Heavy jamming. We can't maintain a lock." The last clear message, his voice faltered, was a request for immediate air cover. They said, "They're out of time." The room froze. Even the soft hum of the server seemed to dim under the weight of those words. Ellison inhaled slowly, a rasping breath through clenched teeth. "Air assets," he said, his voice a low growl that promised action, if not hope. "What do we have?" The flight operations officer, a woman whose tone normally carried the confidence of someone used to command, answered with the cold finality of a verdict. "Sir, the F-35 fleet is still grounded, targeting array failures. We're waiting on the manufacturer's patch. The F-18s are all mid-refuel at Auxiliary Field C9, supporting Operation Sandstorm. Priority 1 supply run to the Eastern Front. We can't abort. And the weather over ZK4, she hesitated. Microburst conditions. Any low-altitude pass would be suicidal. How long for the F-18s? Earliest ETA? 42 minutes. 42 minutes. Ellison repeated the number in his head, feeling its weight crush him. He ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, the scrape of rough hair against his palm, nothing compared to the grinding knot in his chest. Every page of the manual, every sacred protocol he had spent his career upholding, pointed to the same conclusion. Echo Unit 3 was already dead. But he couldn't make peace with that. He couldn't watch 12 red-blooded soldiers die just to keep a form clean and a mission report unblemished. His self-control fractured. The colonel's fist came down on the table with a sharp, cracking report that made several junior staffers flinch. "To hell with the book," he snarled, his voice low, guttural, and vibrating with barely leashed fury. "I don't care about the damn logistics. I don't care about protocol. Find me something that flies. Anything. I don't care if it's a jet, a chopper, or a crop duster. If it can get a shadow over that valley and give those men 5 more minutes to fight, I want it in the air." The room erupted in a storm of keystrokes and hurried voices. Screens flickered as personnel searched through fleet inventories and emergency alerts, chasing a ghost of hope. For a few heartbeats, there was nothing but the buzz of machinery and the frantic tap of fingers. Then, from the back of the room, a hesitant voice cut through the chaos. "Sir, we, we have one pilot ready." Ellison turned, his eyes narrowing. "A-10 pilot, sir," the junior staffer said, his throat dry. "Her bird is fueled and armed at the auxiliary field." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then Ellison's laugh, sharp, bitter, and disbelieving, broke it. "An A-10?" he said, the syllables dripping with scorn. "That relic? That flying bulldozer with wings?" He turned his glare fully on the young man. "I asked for a surgical asset, something that can get in, strike, and vanish, not a museum piece. That thing is a rusty hammer, not a scalpel. It's older than half the pilots in this room." He waved the suggestion away like an annoying fly and turned back to the map, the bleak red pulse of Echo Unit 3 still flashing in the ravine. His shoulders sank, the fight in his voice replaced with the quiet weight of inevitability. The F-18s would arrive eventually. 42 minutes. But for Echo 3, it might as well have been forever. Colonel Marcus Ellison stood at the center of the operations room, the low hum of servers filling the silence as the after-action report loomed in his mind. In 40 minutes, he would have to write it, and in 40 minutes, he might have to explain to a family why their son had died waiting for protocol to play out. The thought was bitter and cold, one that had haunted military commanders for generations. Then a new voice cut through the muted tension. It was Miller, the radar technician, a grizzled veteran whose voice was usually a calm monotone. Now it carried a sharp edge of alarm. "Sir, I have a new contact." The room froze. Ellison's hand stopped over the map. His voice, when it came, was steady, drained of all emotion. This was his world, and he knew it well. "ID." "Negative, sir," Miller said, his fingers flying across the console. "No transponder, no IFF. It's a ghost blip, but it's no malfunction. Clear radar signature, low altitude, hugging the terrain. Speeds high, heading straight for ZK. Every eye in the room turned toward the glowing radar screen. A single green dot cut across the digital map, moving with a relentless, almost predatory precision. It wasn't a random plane. It wasn't even just an unauthorized intrusion. It was a hunter, moving in with purpose. Ellison's blood ran cold. He knew that flight pattern. He knew the way it slipped through valleys and along the ridgelines, invisible to standard scans, moving fast and low. It was the work of an expert, not a rookie, and certainly not anyone flying under official orders. A shiver ran up his spine. This wasn't just a rogue pilot. This was a ghost from his past, a nightmare he'd tried to bury. His gaze shifted to the young officer who had earlier suggested the A-10 deployment. The officer's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. His voice was barely a whisper, not to Ellison, but to the room, to the ghost on the screen. "There's only one pilot who'd fly like that, and she's not supposed to exist." The words hit Ellison like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. Memories surged past the walls of logic he had built. He saw the chaos of Operation Red Dagger, communications blackout, enemy jammers tearing the net apart, the desperate final calls from a forward squad before they were silenced. The system had failed then, just as it was failing now. The F-18s had been too far out. The F-35s were grounded. Command had said, "Stand down. Wait." But one pilot hadn't waited. She had been young, with a hard, unflinching gaze. A maverick who refused to let red tape dictate life or death. Elena Marquez, call sign, Falcon 7. Ellison remembered the radar screen that day. A frantic light show of movement as her A-10, already considered obsolete, dove straight into the fire. She ignored every order, every threat of court-martial. She went in blind, relying on nothing but her eyes and a deep, instinctive read of the battlefield. Command had punished her for it, grounded her, stripped her rank, ruined her career. But she had saved 19 men, 19 lives that the system had already written off as acceptable losses. The memory receded, leaving Ellison staring at the present, at the green blip cutting across the screen with that same reckless, fearless resolve. Falcon 7. The flight profile, the speed, the defiance of every rule. It could only be her. She had heard Echo Unit 3's desperate call, and like a ghost rising from the past, She was answering it. A phantom pilot in a phantom jet, flying to save a squad the world had already counted out. Ellison felt awe, dread, and a reluctant respect tighten in his chest. He knew exactly what she was going to do, and he knew with a bone-deep certainty that nothing in this room, no command he could give, would stop her. The operations center at Fort Reen seemed to hold its breath. The servers hummed. No one spoke. Every eye was glued to the solitary green blip as it carved a lethal path across the map. "She's not supposed to exist," the young officer whispered again, the words lingering like smoke in the silence. Ellison felt his rigid commander's posture falter. He had always lived by the chain of command, by rules and procedure. Yet the ghost of Falcon 7 operated outside all of that, a living contradiction to everything he believed in. In his mind, two voices clashed. "She's a liability, a rogue element. If I allow this, I'm sanctioning chaos." And then the quieter voice, "She's the only chance those men have. The system has failed. The one the system cast out is the only one who can fix it." Ellison's hand trembled as he reached for the comms mic. He squared his shoulders, reclaiming the weight of command even as his insides churned. His voice was cold steel when it came. "Unidentified A-10, state your ID and return to base. That's a direct order." Finality rang in the room, his last desperate attempt to pull the rogue back into the fold, to see if time had dulled the fire in her soul. Static, nothing else. Miller glanced up, worry deepening the creases on his face. "Sir, she's flying silent. Either she's not receiving or she's choosing not to respond. But her path," and he hesitated, then finished, "it's locked, dead on for Echo 3's position." Colonel Marcus Ellison's worst fear crystallized the moment the comms officer uttered the words, "last known position." There was no room left for doubt. This wasn't a miscommunication or a glitch in the system. This was an act of will, calculated, deliberate. Falcon 7 knew the rules. She had weighed them, dismissed them, and chosen her own course. Ellison's hand tightened on the microphone until his knuckles went white. His voice came out low and edged with steel. "Falcon 7, he said, forcing each word through clenched teeth. "I know who you are. This is a direct order. You are not cleared for this mission. Return to base immediately. Do not make me classify you as hostile." The final threat rang hollow, and both of them knew it. He wasn't going to fire on an American pilot, especially not one risking her life to save American soldiers. He was trapped in his own paradox, a commander boxed in by rules that now felt meaningless. Then the room crackled with a voice. Calm, clear, utterly composed. A woman's voice that cut clean through the tension. "This is Falcon 7. I hear you, Colonel. Echo 3 needs help. I'm in position to provide it." No arrogance, no defiance, just an unshakable statement of fact from a professional who knew her purpose. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't negotiating. She was telling him the battlefield truth. The mission mattered more than his orders. Silence swallowed the operations center. Ellison's mind raced. He could insist on procedure and watch Echo 3 die while she refused to return. Or he could give voice to the one reality no manual could deny. Without her, those men were already gone. The decision was wrenched from him by a desperate voice over the comms, raw, breaking under the weight of terror. "Any air support at all, please? We're out of time. We're taking heavy fire." The plea ripped through the sterile command room, leaving no space for rules or hesitation. Ellison's eyes flicked from the tactical map, where Echo 3's position pulsed in the middle of a swarm of enemy icons, to the radar screen, where the blip of the A-10 was now practically overhead. He slammed his palm onto the mic, his eyes closed for the briefest, excruciating moment. And when he spoke, it wasn't a command. It was surrender to reality. "Falcon 7, you are cleared to engage." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. He knew she was already diving into the fight. She had stopped waiting for orders a long time ago, ever since the day waiting too long had cost her everyone she'd sworn to protect. The operations room froze in collective suspense. Seconds stretched into an eternity. On the radar, Falcon 7's green blip dropped and then vanished entirely as she hugged the terrain, a phantom with a singular lethal purpose. Far below, Echo 3 clung to life behind a pitiful scatter of rocks. Their ammunition was nearly gone. Smoke and dust choked the sky, and despair settled heavy in their chests. They scanned the gray haze for any sign of salvation, and then they heard it. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a jet far above. It was a guttural growl, a primal mechanical snarl that shook the earth beneath their boots. Out of the fog emerged the silhouette of an A-10 Warthog, flying so low it seemed part of the ground itself, a predator in its natural hunting grounds. A sergeant on the ground let out a raw, disbelieving shout. "That's a Warthog! We've got air! We've got air!" In the ops room, Miller, the radar tech, stared at his screen in awe. "She's flying visual, sir. In this soup of smoke and fog. She can't get a lock. It's impossible." But the next sound shattered all doubt. It wasn't an explosion in the distance. It was the earth-shaking roar of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a sound more felt than heard, a tearing, metallic thunder like 1,000 chainsaws revving in unison. On the screen, enemy positions erupted in fire and smoke. Artillery nests winked out one by one under the A-10's precise, merciless fire. On the ground, Echo 3's soldiers cheered, a ragged, primal chorus of relief and disbelief, their voices filtering back through the comms like echoes from the edge of death. Ellison watched, gripped by a cold mixture of dread and awe. Miller had been right. With the jamming, the fascia, and the case, no aircraft could have locked targets by system. Falcon 7 wasn't flying on technology. She was flying on pure skill, on instinct honed by experience and fearlessness, a living embodiment of the craft. And as the enemy blips disappeared from the tactical screen, a memory slammed into him with brutal clarity. Operation Red Dagger, a mission that had gone wrong in the seconds. A small recon team trapped, just like Echo 3. Comms jammed. Rules said stand down. The system he had devoted his life to had failed. He had given the order to abort. He had watched the radar in grim silence, accepting the inevitable. And then, just like today, a lone A-10 appeared where no aircraft should have been. Falcon 7, Elena Marquez. She hadn't come to destroy. She had come to protect, to draw fire away from the doomed soldiers below, making herself a target so they could escape. She had flown into a kill zone over and over, defying both orders and death itself. Not a warrior, a guardian. Ellison remembered the shame that burned in his chest that day, the awe that hollowed him out, the anger at himself for not being the one to act. And now, as the echoes of the Avenger cannon rolled across the battlefield and enemy fire faltered under her relentless attack, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. Falcon 7 had never changed. She had always been willing to bear the weight he could not. The wreck lay where she had forced it down, a lonely silhouette on a rural road. Her engine had died mid-descent, her hydraulics torn apart, and the aircraft had limped to its last heartbeat. The memory, half flashback, half confession, unfolded like a scar in Colonel Ellison's mind. She hadn't returned from Red Dagger because she escaped. She had returned because she chose to come back. That choice alone unlocked something inside him. A revelation about the woman who now flew his ghost mission. Flying wasn't a duty for her. It was a promise carved into her bones. She flew because she knew, in a way words could never fully capture, what it meant to be left behind. She didn't chase medals, and she didn't hunt glory. She flew for the men on the ground whose luck was bleeding out with every second. She was no rogue. She was a compass, a living embodiment of a duty that stood above orders and beyond rules. As Ellison watched her final attack run complete, the distinctive roar of the GAU-8 cannon faded into the distance, and he understood he wasn't just witnessing another mission. He was watching a legend take shape before his eyes, and he had a front-row seat to the truth behind that legend. In the operations center at Fort Reen, silence pressed down like a physical weight. Even the afterimage of the cannon's thunder seemed to hang in the air, reverberating in the memory of every officer present. The GAU-8's voice had been a symphony of annihilation and salvation, and now that it was gone, the quiet it left behind felt almost holy. Colonel Marcus Ellison, veteran of battlefields that had chewed up and spat out men far less prepared, stood frozen, his posture a portrait of shock restrained only by discipline. His eyes locked on the central console as enemy artillery blips shifted from hostile red to soft, lifeless gray. The impossible had just happened, and every man and woman in the room knew it. The air itself had changed. A moment ago it had smelled of metal and tension, saturated with the anticipation of death. Now it carried the strange, weightless scent of a miracle. A junior staffer, the same one who had dared whisper Falcon 7 earlier, stared at the display in wide-eyed awe, his terror transmuted into the quiet, disbelieving pride of a man who had just glimpsed something extraordinary. Even Miller, the usually unshakable radar technician, sat stiffly at his console, jaw slack. He'd seen every pattern a battlefield could spit out, and yet this was different. What just happened? Someone whispered, the words trembling as though afraid to disturb the spell in the room. Before anyone could answer, the comms console crackled to life. A voice broke through, trembling with adrenaline and a kind of raw, almost childlike relief. Base, this is Echo 3. The artillery is gone. That pilot, the soldier's voice cracked. I've never seen anything like it. Are you getting this? 12 men who had already made their peace with death were alive, and their voices carried the weight of that resurrection. The operations room felt a surge all at once, a wave of emotion that didn't need words to be understood. Ellison leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with the disbelief he couldn't quite shake. Copy that, Echo 3. We read you loud and clear. Confirm the damage. The answer came back choked with awe. Confirmative. 3 hidden gun emplacements destroyed. Clean hits, no overspray, no friendly fire. And she didn't even use target locks. Our own systems couldn't pick them up, sir. The words hung there, a testimony to a feat that bordered on the supernatural. The most advanced targeting computers they possessed couldn't have done it, but a single human had. In a battlefield choked with fog and chaos, she had hunted death with nothing but her eyes and instincts. A young munitions analyst tore her gaze from her diagnostics and looked pale as chalk. Sir, I've pulled the telemetry from the A-10. She only fired 60 rounds from the GAU-8 when the number detonated in the room with the weight of a physical blow. 60? Someone repeated, almost choking on the syllables. 3 emplacements, 60 rounds. It was mathematically absurd. Most pilots would have burned 3 times that amount just to have a chance at success. And even then, collateral damage was almost guaranteed. The GAU-8 wasn't built for delicacy. It was a storm in a steel tube, meant to shred everything in a wide cone of destruction. To use it with surgical precision was to rewrite its very nature. It was like using a sledgehammer to tap in a watchmaker's pin, except the nail was buried in the case of a live battlefield. Ellison scanned the room, desperate for an explanation no one could give him. How the hell is that even possible? His voice was not an order. It was a plea. A new voice cut through the tension like a steadying hand. It was older, roughened by years and wisdom. Frank, the senior advisor, a retired A-10 pilot who had spent more than 3 decades in the cockpit of the Warthog, stepped from the shadowed edge of the room. He had watched in silence until now, but his gaze never left the flickering blip of Falcon 7 on the monitor. Sir, he said quietly, that level of precision, that's not just talent. That's the mark of a pilot who spent years in skies where a miss wasn't an option. Ellison's curiosity burned hotter now. What do you mean? Frank exhaled, and his words rolled out like a soft voiceover, the kind that belonged to memories of a harsher era. I mean, she's flown in places where every shot had to count, where there were no second chances, no backup, no modern computers to hold your hand. A miss out there didn't just mean a failed mission. It meant someone died. Maybe her. Maybe the people she was trying to save. That kind of flying, it's almost gone now. It's not born in simulators or manuals. It's born in fire, in necessity. And it leaves marks you can't see. Ellison listened, and the ghost of a memory surfaced. Elena Marquez, the pilot who had been cast aside after Operation Red Dagger. Now he understood. Her defiance, her punishment, the system's attempt to grind her down, it had all forged her into this. A blade honed to an edge the military couldn't replicate, and now she was cutting through their battles on her own terms. He had 1,000 questions and no patience for any of them. He needed her voice. He needed the debrief. He needed to know how a human being had just rewritten the limits of war. He grabbed the mic, and this time, his words carried no command, only a naked, urgent plea. Falcon 7, come in. We need your debrief. We need to know your status. The room froze, breathless, waiting for the voice that had saved them. Nothing, only dead air, silent confirmation that the legend had vanished into the void. She hadn't come for a medal or a debrief or to face a court-martial. She had come to do one thing, and that thing was done. The comms officer made another attempt, cycling through frequencies with growing frustration. Static. Nothing. Falcon 7 had disappeared again, vanished into the sky like a ghost who had arrived only to snatch a dozen men from death, then slip away before anyone could even say thank you. The next voice to break the silence wasn't hers. It was a final transmission from Echo Unit 3. Their sergeant's tone was quiet now, filled with a deep, almost reverent respect as it cut through the static. This is Echo 3. We're mobile, moving to the extraction point. Just wanted to say, that pilot, she saved all 12 of us. The words hit like the last, perfect note in a symphony. A simple, unadorned statement that carried the weight of everything they had just endured. Colonel Marcus Ellison sank back into his chair, the enormity of the moment pressing down on him like a mountain. He had lived his entire career by the book. Every regulation followed. Every procedure executed to the letter. And all that careful adherence had been marching him, in Echo Unit 3, straight toward a catastrophe he would never have been able to undo. But it hadn't been his plan or his precision that saved them. It had been a rogue pilot, a ghost in an old A-10 Warthog, who had thrown the rulebook out the window. He murmured to himself, barely audible even in the hush of the room, the words a quiet confession to a truth that upended everything he thought he knew. 12 soldiers alive, because she ignored the order. If she'd listened, they'd all be dead. The bitter irony of it burned in his chest. He had stood right here in this very operations center and dismissed the A-10 as a relic, a rusty hammer in an age of surgical instruments. But tonight, when the scalpels of modern warfare had failed, it was that rusty hammer that had struck true and saved lives. The silence that followed was heavy, but not with defeat. It was something stranger, harder to name, a victory that felt almost unsettling. It pressed on everyone in the Fort Reen Operations Center, a weight you could feel in your bones. Colonel Ellison stayed in his chair, staring at the dark screens in front of him, a man trying to reconcile logic with the impossible. His whole life had been built in a world where cause and effect were tidy, predictable, measurable. But the last 10 minutes had shattered that world. 12 men were breathing right now, not because of a flawless plan, but because someone had dared to defy the plan entirely and done it perfectly. As the first wave of shock ebbed, it left behind a restless current of something else. Professional curiosity, sharp and electric. The question had shifted. No longer what happened, but how. How had a single unauthorized A-10 flown by a ghost pilot achieved what the most advanced technology in the world had deemed impossible? Radar technician Miller had been staring at his screen the whole time, his brow furrowed with a grim, focused intensity. He was a man trying to disprove a miracle with raw data. Finally, he looked up, his voice barely more than a reverent whisper. Sir, I've been running her flight path on replay. The raw data, this isn't just skill. This is something else entirely. Miller wasn't one for exaggeration. If he said it was a miracle, that carried weight. What is it, Miller? Tell me, Ellison demanded, his voice low now, intense, urgent, stripped of all the sharp edges of command. Miller's fingers danced across the holographic display, tracing a three-dimensional projection of Falcon 7's flight path. She didn't just fly low, he said. She used the terrain itself. Every ridge, every shadow cast by the mountains. She hid in them, stayed out of radar completely. Sir, she was a ghost, literally. In the world of modern aviation, it was a lost art. Computers did that work now. Terrain following autopilot, stealth algorithms. The machines flew the missions and the humans mostly supervised. But Falcon 7 had done it manually, by eye, by instinct, with an almost preternatural feel for the land beneath her wings. The comms officer, pale and wide-eyed from her own analysis, looked up from her console. Her attack vector, she came in at an angle that gave her a perfect line of sight on the target's while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. She was planning her run in real time, on the fly. Sir, it was cleaner than any pre-programmed strike we've ever run. She hesitated, the only word that fit feeling out of place in the room. It's a work of art. The words hung in the air, fragile and undeniable. Art, in a fortress of screens and logic and data. And yet nothing else described it. Falcon 7 hadn't flown a mission. She had painted a masterpiece of destruction and salvation in the same stroke. A junior analyst swallowed hard and finally spoke, his voice trembling. Sir, that kind of flying, it's so precise, so knowing. It's like she knew where the targets were before she saw them, almost as if she had the battlefield mapped in her head. That thought sent a chill through the room. Her gift wasn't just piloting, it was understanding the combat space on an intuitive level. No AI, no satellite, no sensor suite could replicate. Ellison's mind leapt to the past, to the ghost of Operation Red Dagger. He'd seen this before, that same impossible precision, that same defiance of logic. The system had broken her, he realized, but in breaking her, it had forged something rarer, more dangerous. A legend, a living myth, now haunting his skies. He had 1,000 questions clawing at him, and a sick certainty that he'd never get an answer unless he could bring her back. He grabbed the mic, voice raw with a mix of authority and desperation. Falcon 7, come in. We need your debrief. We need your status. That's a direct order. Return to base. Now. The words felt hollow as they left his mouth. The balance of power had shifted. He wasn't the commander anymore. He was the supplicant, begging for the ghost to acknowledge him. Nothing. The comms officer tried again, fingers flying, but the line was dead. Falcon 7 had cut her channel. Mission complete. Ghost gone. Then Miller spoke one last time, his voice somber, almost reverent. Sir, she's off our scopes, completely. Out of range. The words hit like a hammer. She had come. She had done the impossible. And she had vanished without a trace, nothing left but the memory of a green blip and a dozen soldiers breathing who should have been dead. Colonel Ellison stayed where he was, surrounded by people but utterly alone, staring at the empty screen where the ghost had once been. He had nothing left but the silence. Colonel Marcus Ellison sat in the command center, staring at the blank screen where the ghostly blip of the A-10 had once flickered. He had won a battle he couldn't explain and owed a debt he couldn't repay. And somewhere out there, a pilot he couldn't even find had done the impossible. The weight of the mystery pressed against his chest like a physical force. He turned to the junior officer, the one who had first mentioned the A-10, his face carved into a mask of cold, unwavering resolve. You said her call sign was retired after Red Dagger, Ellison said, his voice low and sharp. You said she wasn't on any list. Yes, sir, the young officer replied, still awed by what they had witnessed. Then get me the files, every document tied to Operation Red Dagger. I want to know who Elena Marquez is, why she's not on any list, and how she did what no one else could. I want everything. His voice rumbled like distant thunder, a promise that the hunt had begun. This was no longer about a tactical anomaly or a blip on a radar. It was about a human being, a woman who had defied the rigid laws of military procedure and the cruel physics of combat to save 12 men from certain death. A senior officer stepped forward, the retired A-10 pilot everyone simply called Frank. His tone was grim. Sir, those files are sealed, restricted. You'll need special clearance. Weeks, maybe longer. Ellison didn't even glance at him. His gaze stayed locked on the empty screen. I don't care if it's buried under the Pentagon. Someone saved 12 soldiers tonight. The system abandoned them and she didn't. I want answers. And I want them now. Get me that clearance. This isn't just about a mission anymore. It's about a legend. And I need to know the truth behind it. The room went silent except for the soft hum of machines. The battle was over. The men were safe. And yet the operations center had taken on a new life. A hushed, reverent atmosphere. Like a library devoted to secrets long buried. Officers and technicians, once consumed by the heat of live combat, now became historians and archaeologists, digging through the sediment of military bureaucracy for a truth hidden under decades of protocol. A request for a digital key was sent. A virtual gate creaked open. Screens flashed red with warnings of classified material and restricted access. An electronic protest against what they were about to unearth. And then, after a tense few minutes, a single file appeared on the main display. Operation Red Dagger. The room seemed to hold its breath. One of the senior staffers, who had been silent all night, stepped forward. His voice was somber. "I remember Red Dagger, sir. I was just a junior officer back then. We lost 6 aircraft and 22 crew in the opening wave. The intel was bad from the start." He recounted the nightmare in halting detail, filling in the gaps of a story time had tried to bury. Operation Red Dagger had been doomed before it even launched. A mixed squadron had been sent into a hostile zone based on faulty intelligence that missed one critical fact. The enemy had mobile surface-to-air missile units and heavy electronic jamming capabilities. The moment the squadron crossed into enemy airspace, chaos erupted. Communications went dead. GPS screens went black. The planned strike dissolved into a slaughter in the dark. Ellison's jaw tightened as the technician scrolled through the file. Each line of text was a knife, reopening old wounds. There, among the records, was his own signature, his younger self authorizing the stand-down order. He had done what the manual required, the only rational choice. Call it a total loss. The 18 remaining personnel were declared unrecoverable. Rescue attempts were aborted. Command had moved on. But the file didn't end there. The technician's hands trembled as she scrolled deeper into the restricted section, where entire paragraphs had been stripped from official reports, the things no one wanted written down. What emerged wasn't just an incident, it was a revelation, a story erased because it embarrassed the system itself. The voice of the past seemed to speak from the screen. Her name was Elena Marquez, an A-10 pilot with a reputation for flying impossible missions under fire, with commendations for close air support in nightmare conditions. Officially, she wasn't even part of Operation Red Dagger. Her name wasn't on the flight log, the comms roll, or any mission brief. She had been assigned as a backup at a remote auxiliary field. Little more than a placeholder in the chain of command. Then the disaster struck. Comms failed. Pilots screamed into the void. The battlefield went silent, and Elena Marquez made a choice. Command sent the stand-down order. No further attempts. The battlefield was lost. 18 men were written off as doomed. But Elena refused to let the story end that way. Without clearance, without a wingman, without even functional comms, she rolled down the runway and lifted her Warthog into the void. No radio, no satellite link, no GPS. Only the hum of her engines and the icy clarity of a pilot who refused to accept that her brothers in arms would die alone. Ellison leaned toward the screen, his voice almost a whisper. How did she find them? Frank, the retired A-10 pilot, answered, his words heavy with reverence. She didn't coordinate a rescue, sir, he said softly. She was the rescue. She became their shield. The room fell into a silence that felt almost sacred. They were no longer just reading a report. They were witnessing the birth of a legend. Over 8 relentless hours, she made 17 runs straight through the kill zone. Elena Marquez, Falcon 7 to the few who still whispered her call sign, turned herself into a moving target. She skimmed the treetops, barely brushing the canopy. She dropped flares and decoys, baiting every hostile eye in the valley. She danced across radar like a streak of light, daring the enemy to see her, to fire, to chase. Every maneuver bought inches for the scattered medevac and recovery crews creeping toward the wounded. She gave them time. She gave them space. She gave them the one thing no one else could, an actual chance to live. On her 17th and final pass, the sky itself seemed to betray her. A missile found its mark. The A-10 shuddered under the impact, hydraulics bleeding out, engines coughing black smoke. The navigation array blinked into darkness. Any other pilot would have pulled the handle if the ejection seat still functioned at all. Elena didn't. She clung to the bird, fighting it every second, guiding it like a dying animal to one last landing. The plane hit a rural access road 20 meters beyond the hot zone and skidded, grinding metal into dirt, sparks clawing at the night. When it stopped, the Warthog was a smoking carcass of twisted steel, and Elena Marquez climbed out, burned, bleeding, but on her feet. 18 soldiers owed their lives to that defiance. Every single one she'd gone in for survived. Colonel Marcus Ellison read the report in silence, jaw set hard enough to ache. The inevitable question rose in his chest, sharp and bitter, more accusation than inquiry. Then why the hell was she suspended? The technician didn't look up from her screen. Her voice dropped to a chill monotone. She broke a direct order. Command had classified those 18 as unrecoverable. She was told to stand down. The words landed like a gavel. A hearing followed. Clinical. Detached. Command offered her two choices: accept a formal reprimand, sign a statement of disobedience, and keep flying, or contest the ruling, defend her actions, and face automatic discharge with no appeal. Elena didn't blink. Her answer ended up buried in the footnotes of a debrief that would never circulate. The technician read it aloud anyway, voice trembling. I won't apologize for saving 18 lives. If that gets me kicked out, so be it. One line, pure, uncut conviction. That's what her entire career, her entire legacy had been reduced to, and the system cut her loose. The same machine that had trained her, trusted her, decorated her, threw her away for daring to do the thing they all swore to do: save lives. The room fell still. The voiceover softened into a somber rhythm, like a slow echo in a courtroom. Elena Marquez had been the finest rescue pilot they had ever produced. Not because she obeyed orders, but because she knew when orders no longer mattered. For that, they erased her. But some truths refused to stay buried. And now she was flying again. The room at Fort Reagan went silent. Even the hum of the ops center felt muted, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the story. The tragedy had an almost Shakespearean weight. Heroism punished by the very system it had served. Ellison stared at the signature on the discharge order, the same one that had condemned 18 soldiers to die. Had she obeyed? The irony burned like poison. Then the technician's scrolling stopped. She inhaled sharply. Sir, there's more. These are unofficial logs. A retired tech had refused to let the story die, quietly compiling cryptic, unverified reports. 17 unsanctioned rescues over 3 years. 17 missions where command said too risky, stand down. Yet someone flew in. 17 missions with 0 deaths. The number seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. Ellison rose and approached the wall map. His fingers traced the lines of canceled missions, each one ending in an impossible rescue. The comms officer leaned in, voice hushed. Every one of them followed a mission cancellation. Hours later, she was there. The pattern snapped into focus. Silent, precise, ghost-like. She's listening, Ellison murmured, a chill running through him. She's tapped into our comms. She waits for the calls. We don't answer. The ops center air grew cold, not from the vents, but from the weight of what that meant. Falcon 7 wasn't just a rogue pilot. She was a shadow, a last resort conscience in a world that had lost its own. A ghost born not of victory, but of tragedy. And now she had appeared in his own operation, saving his own men. The frenzied energy of the command center ebbed into a quiet, heavy contemplation. Screens still glowed, data still scrolled, but no one moved. Colonel Marcus Ellison sat at his desk, staring at the closed file that had cracked his entire understanding of loyalty, rules, and the cost of survival. He had spent a career defending the system. Now he'd seen its failure and the impossible triumph of a single moral compass that existed outside it. Some things, he realized, were more important than orders. Hours passed. Ellison combed through old flight logs, cross-checking Falcon 7's phantom rescues against every mission the brass had scrubbed. The pattern was undeniable. A single pilot had been moving like a ghost through the shadows of military history. From skeptic to believer, from strict enforcer to reluctant guardian of an unspoken truth, Ellison had changed. He knew now she was out there, listening for the silence no one else would answer. Where was she now? What did she want? The answer came not in a coded message, but a routine call from a junior security officer at Auxiliary Field C9, a forgotten strip of concrete on the base's far edge. "Sir," the voice crackled through the line, hesitant. "We've got an unregistered aircraft on the tarmac, A-10. No transponder, no flight plan. Cockpit's empty. It just appeared." Ellison's heart missed a beat. He didn't need a description. He already knew whose ghost had returned. Colonel Marcus Ellison stood in the command center, surrounded by the muted hum of electronics and the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, when the first report reached him. A sudden, visceral image formed in his mind, the worn yet powerful silhouette of an A-10 Warthog, the ghost of a bygone era returned to life. His reaction was immediate and precise. "Lock down the area. Secure the perimeter. No one touches the aircraft. Do not process it as evidence. Stand back and wait for me." He didn't sound like a man issuing a routine military order. His voice carried something else, reverence, the tone of someone handling a sacred relic rather than a piece of equipment. The journey to the auxiliary airfield felt less like a drive and more like a pilgrimage. Ellison left behind the sterile walls of the command center, trading their artificial brightness for the pre-dawn mist rolling across the empty roads. When the vehicle finally stopped, he stepped out alone. The last few hundred feet he walked in silence, a solitary figure approaching an even more solitary machine. There it was. The A-10 Warthog, Falcon 7 ship, sat on the tarmac like a monument from another time. Its armor plating was a mosaic of battle scars, each dent and scrape a story untold. Its engines were silent now, yet they carried the quiet authority of a journey completed. This aircraft had been built for a different war, one that had long since passed. And yet, in the hands of Elena Marquez, Falcon 7, it had become something far more than a weapon. It had become a beacon of hope. Ellison approached slowly, his hand trailing across the cool, scarred metal as if he were tracing the face of an old friend. He climbed the integrated ladder and eased himself into the cockpit, stepping into her world. It was nothing like he had imagined. He had expected the cockpit of an ancient Warthog to be a tangle of fraying wires and outdated instruments. Instead, it was immaculate. Every gauge gleamed, every switch had been polished, every targeting display was perfectly aligned. The avionics arrays, painstakingly rebuilt from the ground up, spoke of a kind of engineering that was both professional and achingly personal. The air smelled of hydraulic fluid and polished metal, a scent he found unexpectedly comforting. And there, resting neatly on the dashboard where a pilot's flight log might normally sit, was a single folded piece of paper. Ellison lifted it with hands that trembled ever so slightly. The handwriting was clean, unadorned, like her voice over the comms. The message was simple, and it cut straight to his heart. "Not here for medals, just for proof we made it." It wasn't a note to him. It wasn't a message for the Air Force or the chain of command. It was for her, and maybe for the soldiers on the ground she'd risked everything to protect. In that moment, the last missing piece of a moral puzzle snapped into place. Falcon 7 didn't fly for glory or recognition. She flew for them, for the men who depended on her, and for her own peace of mind, knowing that her sacrifices weren't in vain. A quiet voice pulled him back. A maintenance NCO approached, a grizzled veteran with a thick mustache and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much. He had been standing at a distance, watching everything. "Sir," the NCO said in a low, respectful tone, "I know you said not to touch it, but I've been looking it over. From here, its condition. Honestly, I've never seen anything like it. This bird is cleaner than most of our active fleet. Someone's been taking care of her. Real care." Ellison wordlessly handed him the note, still reeling from the raw honesty in its message. "Any idea where it's been?" he asked. The NCO shook his head. "No record, sir, but judging by the wear patterns and the custom tweaks, I'd say she's been flying solo for years. The mods, these aren't regulation. Reinforced armor, avionics tuned for absolute precision, ammo racks set up for maximum output with zero waste. This isn't standard military maintenance, this is personal." Not long after, another man arrived. A retired A-10 pilot, Frank, who had spent his entire career with the Warthog. He had heard the whispers of the ghost aircraft and had come to see it for himself. When his eyes landed on the jet, he didn't just see metal and machinery. His gaze carried something like spiritual recognition. "This isn't just upkeep," Frank murmured, almost to himself. His voice was a soft, reverent whisper. This, this is love. Someone loves this jet. Every bolt, every panel, it's all cared for from the heart. The words hit Ellison with quiet force. He had already seen proof of Falcon 7's impossible skill in the air. But here, inside this immaculate cockpit, he saw proof of something deeper. Her humanity. She wasn't a machine, and she wasn't bound by orders or regulations. She was a woman whose entire life had been braided into this aircraft, whose sense of duty transcended medals, contracts, or chains of command. Ellison felt something in him give way. The rigid walls of protocol and logic he had lived behind for decades cracked, then broke. None of the rules mattered anymore. Only the truth in front of him did. He turned to the sergeant, his voice firm now, carrying the weight of a new resolve. "Move this aircraft to Hangar 7. Full security, but do not process it as evidence. Don't log it. Treat it like a reserve unit. Someone might need it again." And with that, the unofficial began. The A-10 was quietly rolled into the forgotten shadows of Hangar 7, which became, without formal declaration, a shrine. Word spread, not of scandal or failure, but of legend. Pilots drifted in to see the machine for themselves, studying the impossible modifications, the signs of a life lived with purpose that outran any uniform or rank. Then came the strange reports. Ground crews swore the Warthog was always spotless, always fueled, always combat ready, yet no maintenance orders were ever logged. A crew chief once shook his head and said in awe, "It's like she gets serviced when no one's watching." The security officer assigned to the hangar began to mention fleeting shadows, figures slipping past cameras and patrols under cover of darkness, vanishing into the pre-dawn mist. Whenever these stories reached Ellison, he only offered a faint, knowing smile. "Maybe they're not meant to be caught," he would say quietly. "Some things work better when we don't get in the way." Unofficially, he issued a directive. After hours, access to Hangar 7 would remain flexible. No one said it aloud, but the entire base had become a silent accomplice to the legend. When his deputy finally asked what they should call this clandestine arrangement, Ellison didn't hesitate. His answer was the culmination of everything he had learned, a quiet declaration of a new worldview. "Call it insurance," Vonnie said, his eyes fixed on the shadowed A-10 in Hangar 7, "for the day the system doesn't show up." And in that moment, the commander who had once believed only in regulations and structure found himself guarding something far greater, a truth, a legend, and a silent promise to the ghost who had earned his respect. In the cockpit of the ghost jet, there was a small engraved badge. It came from the men of Echo 3, a simple metal token with a single line etched into it, a dedication to Falcon 7, the one who always saw danger before the radar ever did. What had once been a whispered shadow of a legend was no longer just a rumor. It had become something living, breathing, and undeniable, a hidden but vital part of the base. It was the final, unspoken contingency for a system that had failed its own people before, and everyone knew would one day fail them again. The A-10 Warthog in Hangar 7 was no longer merely a machine. Once it had been just an aircraft, armor plates, hydraulic lines, and maintenance schedules. But over time, it had transformed into something else. A relic, a silent sentinel, a monument not made of stone or steel alone, but of flight hours, grit, defiance, and razor-edge precision. It sat in the far corner of the airfield like a guardian at rest, immaculate and combat-ready. Yet it was never logged, never formally claimed. Rumors about the ghost Warthog traveled faster than any official memo could hope to. No one ever shouted them across the mess hall or barked them on the tarmac. They traveled in low, reverent tones, drowned under the hum of jet engines or whispered between hurried pre-flight briefings. They passed like sacred stories among those who flew and those who watched the skies, stories carried as if by instinct rather than intention. Young pilots, fresh out of training and still wide-eyed, would find themselves wandering toward Hangar 7 without knowing why. Veterans who had survived every kind of sky, blinding sun, churning storms, tracer fire, would make the same quiet pilgrimage. They came alone sometimes, in twos or threes other times, and they would always stop before the old A-10 in silence, the way one would at a war memorial. Their eyes would roam over its weathered skin, tracing faint scorch marks, custom armor panels, the hand-modified targeting array. Inevitably, someone would murmur, almost to themselves, this wasn't built in a shop, this was carved in combat. It wasn't the technology that drew them to it, it was the meaning. In a world that rested on SOPs and airspace clearances, where authority lived in signatures and radio codes, the A-10 and Hangar 7 had become something else entirely. It was a symbol. It was what happened when the system froze and one person chose to act anyway. It was the vow that no one would be left behind, not while she was still flying. Colonel Marcus Ellison, who had once written the A-10 off as an obsolete relic, now saw it with new eyes. He had watched 12 men return alive because of that so-called antique. And when the dust settled, he made a choice. There would be no official report, no reprimand for the breach of protocol. Instead, he acknowledged it in the only way that mattered. He commissioned a small metal plaque and mounted it in the central hallway of Fort Reen's HQ. There was no name, no rank, no elaborate inscription. Just the silhouette of an A-10 Warthog flying low through the fog, its wings defiant, etched in matte steel. And beneath that silhouette, a single word, Falcon 7. No briefings were ever held about it, no speeches made. Yet word spread like wildfire in quiet channels. New arrivals were led to it in silence, a nod from a fellow pilot, a subtle gesture from a crew chief. And when the inevitable question came, who is Falcon 7? The answer always came in a soft murmur. Someone who knew that saving lives matters more than following orders. Over time, it stopped being about her alone. The myth evolved. Falcon 7 was no longer just a rogue pilot who defied the system. She became an idea, a philosophy, a quiet doctrine whispered among those who had seen firsthand the cost of waiting too long for permission. That small plaque, that unmarked A-10, became the anchor for a new kind of leadership. Not leadership born of signatures and chains of command, but of the courage to act when it mattered most. And yet no one ever spoke of her with fanfare. There were no songs, no medals, no stories in the base newsletter. Only the unspoken understanding that she was still out there somewhere, listening, watching, waiting. The years passed, and the base itself changed in subtle ways. Colonel Ellison never declared a new policy, but everyone under his command understood. When a mission came in that was labeled too dangerous, when the call from higher command was to retreat, a quiet sequence would begin. The comms officer would glance toward the colonel, waiting for nothing more than a faint nod. Then an untraceable frequency would be opened. It was never recorded, never acknowledged, and sometimes it remained a silent void. But other times, it would come alive. A single message would appear on the comms board like a flare cutting through a storm, Falcon 7 in vicinity. There was never a follow-up transmission. No voice, no call sign confirmation. And yet the air in the room would change immediately. Despair would lift into breathless anticipation, because that simple message meant only one thing: someone was still coming. She had become elemental, not just a pilot, not even just a legend. She was a compass, a shadow guardian, a presence that appeared only when the rest of the world turned away. She didn't do it for glory or even for redemption. She did it because lives were still down there, lives that the system had quietly marked as expendable. Her answer had always been the same: not on my watch. Hangar 7 became sacred ground. Everyone knew, not just the ground crews and the tower controllers, but the night shift janitors too. Don't ask why the bird is always spotless, fueled, armed. Don't ask who rolls in after dark. Just know that someone still believes in duty without condition. Falcon 7 was no longer just history. She was a living reminder that sometimes the bravest acts don't ask permission. They simply take flight. 2 years later, the story fast-forwarded to a quiet, somber day. It was Colonel Marcus Ellison's farewell. His command was ending, but his legacy was written not in battle reports or mission counts. It lived in that plaque on the HQ wall, in the unspoken promise that had woven itself into the base's very fabric. Standing before a room full of pilots, Ellison's eyes found the plaque one last time. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of everything he had learned. "You'll face moments," he said, "where the manual can't help you, where doing what's right doesn't line up with what's written. And when that happens, remember this: the mission isn't to follow the book. The mission is to get your people home." It was the final lesson of his career, the conclusion of his own transformation. From a man who trusted only in the system to a man who now trusted the people brave enough to step beyond it. "Sometimes," he added, his voice edged with quiet conviction, "the real work happens outside the wire. That doesn't make it wrong, it makes it vital." After the farewell, a new note appeared in the A-10's cockpit in Hangar 7. A maintenance crew chief found it and left it where it was, knowing exactly who it was for. Just a few handwritten lines. "Thanks for knowing some things matter more than protocol." It was signed simply, R13. The message said everything that needed to be said. She had been watching. And in her own quiet way, she had offered her thanks. When Colonel Sarah Chen, Ellison's handpicked successor, took command, she inherited more than just a unit. She inherited a legend, and she quietly kept the Raven 13 arrangement alive. Over the next 3 years, the Warthog returned to the skies a dozen more times. Each mission was carried out in silence, appearing only when official channels had failed, and then vanishing back into the shadows once the work was done. The small plaque in the operations center transformed into more than just a marker of a pilot's name. It became a symbol, a quiet oath passed from one generation of aviators to the next. Years later, someone carved the final line into it. 8 plain words meant only for those who dared to fly when others turned away. By then, the legend was complete. No longer a ghost whispered about in back rooms, Falcon 7 had become part of the very air the squadron breathed. A constant reminder that duty was not simply a checklist of regulations, but a promise born of the heart. The story of Falcon 7 was unlike the tales of official heroes. Elena Marquez, the pilot who had sacrificed her career for the sake of her code, became a living myth. Her name was spoken in hushed tones, a quiet guardian in the sky, with her aging A-10, a relic that outlived the bureaucracies that once condemned it. It was never about grand victories. It was about a single, unshakable promise. A story that taught an unspoken truth. Some orders should remain unanswered, and some heroes will never wear medals because they fly not for the system, but for those still on the ground, waiting for a savior who sees danger before any radar does. When the operations center at Fort Reen finally went quiet, the story of Falcon 7 began to speak louder than ever. It was a tale born from a simple command: any jet will do, and ended in the creation of a legend. Yet it was never just about an unauthorized rescue or a pilot who dared to disobey. It was a reflection on the very nature of duty, a battle of belief waged not with weapons but with willpower and conscience. Colonel Marcus Ellison's transformation was part of that story. A man forged by protocol, he had built his life around the rulebook, only to have his certainty shattered by a single act of defiance that no report could ever justify. Through Falcon 7, he learned that true command is not the blind enforcement of rules, but the wisdom to recognize when those rules become a cage. His journey from rigid officer to the silent protector of an unspoken tradition proved that even the most unyielding hearts can be changed by selfless courage. He became the architect of a quiet insurance policy, a hidden acknowledgement that no system is perfect. And then there was Falcon 7 herself. Elena was never a rebel for rebellion's sake. She flew for survival, for those who had no one else to rely on. Her precision in the sky was more than skill. It was a vow, hammered into existence by every failure and every mission that had come before. Her battered A-10 wasn't just an outdated aircraft. It was a living monument to love, to loyalty, and to a code that refused to die. Together, the woman and the machine became a single, enduring testament. Honor is not found in ranks or ribbons, but in doing the right thing, even when it costs everything. The plaque in the operations center, the open frequency that remained waiting for a call that might never come, and the whispers that passed quietly among pilots, these became her legacy. Not the kind listed in records, but the kind etched in the memory of those who understood that the truest heroes are often the ones who walk or fly their own path. The story of Falcon 7 lives on as a reminder to anyone who has ever faced a choice between following the system and following their conscience. True honor is found not in recognition, but in the quiet knowledge that you acted when no one else would. It is a testament to the power of a single individual standing against the weight of the world, with nothing but a strong moral compass and a machine they trusted like an old friend. Falcon 7's path was not on open roads, but in open skies. She flew not for glory, not for medals, but because she could not do otherwise. Her story will always belong to those who understand that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose the lonely flight and never look back.